Well, my background, as you may know, is helping organizations think about the future, both in corporations, government agencies, sometimes non-profits. I started off doing work of the shell scenario variety, and I've gradually sort of evolved that approach over time. And I've been doing this since 1990, so quite a long time now. So the sort of habit I get into from doing this kind of work is to be looking as far upstream as possible in any given field. So since technology is very influential, what is upstream of technology is science. So obviously if I can anticipate where science is going, that gives me a sort of head start on where things might be going more generally in the world. So it's an area of interest. I'm interested I'm very interested in science anyway.
Yes.
So my perspective in answering your questions comes from looking at science, not from, as it were, within science, but looking at science to see how it's evolving, and in particular looking to see what elements may be being overlooked by mainstream science that could well be significant in science in sometime in the future. I don't want to be overly critical of science, because your question in a sense invites that. I mean, science is an amazing thing, and it's brought us a long way, and we have a tremendous amount of knowledge we didn't have before. But I think, in a way, science has become so dominant that it's crowded out of our culture the sort of the other side of the picture, which used to exist. And so it's narrowed its scope. It's become scientism. It's generated the feeling in the culture that only it has the authority to answer questions, to generate knowledge and so on. Whereas I think that's a very limited perspective. And the tradition in the past was that knowledge came from, for example, introspection or contemplation, these words which have more or less passed out of our cultural vocabulary. In fact, to the extent that we don't really know what that might mean. And I think there was an attempt in the 19th century to come up with the idea of phenomenology, which was looking at, since we're talking also here about consciousness and its relationship to science, to look for consciousness to look at its own contents. But I think somehow that also was too reductionistic an approach to doing that. And that it's really the attempt to look inwardly at the root of some of the, if you like, the reality that the questions and the knowledge are trying to approach. It's quite a difficult thing to describe,
yes.
Which is perhaps not surprising that science doesn't get hold of the idea very easily.
No, and of course there's a whole historical context, isn't there?
Indeed, there is of a gradual falling away of this other way of thinking and operating.
Yes.
But I think the concern that comes to mind first of all is that science, knowledge is power. And the more power there is, the more responsibility there needs to be. So it's a nice idea that one would encourage science to look at consciousness and start looking beyond the purely physical aspect of things. But of course, my belief is that will give science more power. And since science would then be entering the realm of what may be called the spiritual, or for want of a better term, in other words, what is encountered, not just introspection, the contents of consciousness, but I think it will uncover new knowledge that allows reality to be manipulated, which is what science does. And for that, we need more responsibility. Scientists, society in general needs more responsibility. So my concern, in a way, would not be to immediately start making suggestions as to how science might move in this expanded direction, but to wonder how the responsibility or the ethical side of scientific practice could be emphasized. And perhaps the same opening up, this same expansion, could be applied to expanding this metaphysical background of science, so that along with that, I think, comes an ethical dimension. Now that's where I think it gets tricky, because probably one of the reasons why science has been avoiding, this expansion is precisely because it does bring in an ethical dimension.
Yes.
I think that the crux of this is the question of whether the brain generates consciousness, or whether it's the other way around. This is really the pivotal question, and it's the stumbling block, because physically oriented scientists find it, well, impossible to conceive that consciousness might be prior to the brain. They just make the automatic assumption. And, the people I've spoken to who take that view just think it's an extraordinary notion that consciousness could already be there at large in the universe, and that somehow everything else comes into being because of that. And yet it seems to me that, again, turning to this notion of introspection or contemplation, if you try to ask yourself the sort of metaphysical question, what is lying behind this notion, reality, what we talk about, reality and consciousness. And when I say metaphysics, I don't necessarily mean what academic philosophy might put forward, because of course the logical positivists more or less drove out the whole notion of metaphysics, and it's only just gradually coming back in. Consciousness is what allows us to be aware that we exist, a bit like Descartes' cogito ergo sum. So we are aware, therefore we infer existence. If there was no awareness, then there would, in a sense, be no existence, because there would be nothing to be aware of it, and there would be no difference between that and there being nothing. So for me, that suggests that consciousness is primary. Now, that suggests, and I would also think that this is going back to some unity of consciousness, so that behind reality, or in the core of reality, let's say at the source of reality, there is consciousness, there is a sort of central awareness. I would go so far as to say a central self, because at the center of all consciousness there's a perceiving self. And that means, and we have the connected question that, does complexity arise from simplicity, or is it the other way around? Science tends to look at the complexity that's already there and then try to go back to the simplicity and the origin from looking at what's there. And actually, introspection would suggest it's the other way around. It's much more likely to be a very simple original unity, which then starts differentiating and produces all the variety. That, of course, means that we're connected to this original consciousness, and in fact our consciousness is a part of that original consciousness.
Yes.
And that starts bringing in the ethical dimension, because that starts getting quite uncomfortable if you've lived your whole life as if you were an isolated amoral unit with no accountability. So I think there is this unease about really opening that up. But to come to your question about the brain consciousness interface, of course there are proposals like the Penrose-Hameroff suggestion that it's microtubules, in the neurons and so forth. I mean, this seems quite plausible. And my picture of what's going on is that the brain is, let's say, acting like a receiver of some kind, or a tuner of some kind, and is, let's say, picking up consciousness. Now, of course, if you go a little deeper, if consciousness is the primary thing that exists, then everything else is somehow conjured out of consciousness like an image. And, we have the analogy of a hologram now, and sometime earlier we had the analogy of the Chladni figure, the
Yes.
complex form which comes
Yes.
purely from vibration. So I think we can see how that might occur, even though we don't know in a materialistic scientific sense exactly how that works. But it's highly suggestive, I think, that form structure is emerging out of, let's say, a thought image. Of course, this touches on, you find the same idea in the esoteric traditions. Well, I think, as I sort of touched on earlier, there needs to be a shift in the sort of metaphysical outlook, because it's perfectly possible to do experiments even now, the sort of things that Dean Radin has been doing, looking at consciousness, the influence of consciousness on quantum level experimental setups. But nobody, it seems to me, is going to take that seriously unless they've already made some kind of shift that predisposes them to be willing to look at that kind of evidence. So I think something like a sort of metaphysical shift is required, in which at least the possibility that consciousness is primary and that which is manifest is secondary or emerges from it. Although that, of course, is an answer couched in terms of time, which is also, could be questioned. But unless there's a willingness to look at and investigate the possibility of that, so I'm not suggesting that my suggestions be taken as gospel at all, but rather as a hypothesis. And I believe a plausible hypothesis, and I think that if research was done along those lines, I think, you know, sufficiently ingenious design, something would turn up. Well, I think it probably usually comes about through some experience.
Yes.
So people do actually, more people than one might suppose, have some sort of inner experience, or even mystical experience, you might say. I mean, a lot of these words are rather toxic, you know. But they have experiences which convey direct understanding or insight without there being an apparent source. Now, of course, the usual explanation is, oh, that's the brain sort of processing in the background, it's come out of your unconscious, you know, so on and so forth. But of course, it could, in this other hypothesis, could have come from the larger self, it could have come from the larger knowing. And that can, in some people, then trigger questioning. You know, well, if I experience that, you know, what else is going on? So I mean, we you know, for example, the physicist Carlo Rovelli has recently written a book about time, in which he tells us that he had an experience on LSD, I think, of time stopping. Now that's a sort of chemically assisted experience, but it's still the same kind of breakthrough insight, which then directed the whole of his career. Now, equally, there are people I've spoken to. There was an academic philosopher I worked with in the United States who told me that he had an experience of this sort, but he just discounted it.
I see.
So you just never quite know. He was on, you know, he realized that the invitation to flip, if you like, was there, but didn't want to accept it. So whether more and more people, perhaps, you know, gradually be more predisposed to actually make the flip, are more willing to experiment, because it seems to me a critical thing. I mean, thinking of my own experience, as you begin to experience things of this sort, you then have to ask yourself, well, if I follow this line of experience or this line of thinking, where does it take me? And my conclusion was that it didn't do any harm. You know, information was coming to me which I hadn't had otherwise. There wasn't anything wrong with that. So I might as well just carry on, see what would happen. And if I wanted to stop at any point, I could presumably stop. So I just, you know, took this attitude of a sort of openness, if you like. You know, the confining of explanations as to what's going on in a whole lot of areas is you know, one of the difficulties that science is in. And the further consequences of that are that science explains things in a restricted manner, and then the culture has picked up those same ideas, and the whole frame of interpretation of the culture is narrowed. And, I mean, if you're talking about scientific advances, let's say, if this expansion occurred, which I believe that it can occur. My belief is that that's just waiting to happen. I know that many scientists would, you know, think that there's no evidence for that. You know, that's just a sort of a pure assertion. But let's say my hunch is that that expansion is possible, and it's just waiting to occur. Because in any case, there are a number of, I mentioned Dean Radin, for example, a number of scientists who are pushing in that direction, who are willing to look at these things, and they're getting results. So, you know, scientists like Dean Radin have pushed in that direction. So it seems to me entirely plausible that can happen, and that if and when it does happen, that expands, you know, the knowledge available to science. And I think we'll find ourselves with breakthroughs in biology, medicine, physics, energy, transportation, and so on. And that if it's allowed to occur, would be very significant. Now that, of course, makes one wonder why it's not occurring with all that potential. The imaginative people who could very well pick up on the same clues that I've been picking up on. And one thought I had was that there's actually considerable religious taboo in society against thinking along these lines. I mean, there was in this country a Witchcraft Act for a long time, and you know, nasty things would happen to you if you thought along these lines. And I think in a way, ironically, science likes to think of itself as not religious, but in a way is actually unconsciously restricting itself along the lines of an old religious taboo. Obviously, here there are so many areas of detail that one could go into, and you know, lines of thought that you've touched on that one could go into far more detail and talk, you know, for example, to actually start speculating as to what some of the things we might discover would be. Perhaps one thing I might say is that physics is currently running experiments like the Hadron Collider at CERN, where more and more energy is thrown at structures we think we understand. But it seems to me perhaps an equally possibly more fruitful line of approach would be to suppose that there may be structure below, say, the quantum level, and that this structure is extremely fleeting, very rapid effects at very, very small size scales, and that very often having new tools in science opens up, think of the electron microscope and so on, that if we are able to probe much, much faster timescales at far smaller size domains, I think we will find phenomena there below the quantum level which begin to show us how consciousness is affecting the material. That's my personal hunch. Now, whether that brings in something like, the old-fashioned ether theory revives itself again, or one can think of Rupert Sheldrake's ideas of the morphic field. So I would suggest that we think of consciousness and the material in the Cartesian dualism. These are two separate things. Your question about how does consciousness relate to the brain supposes that there are two things, the physical and consciousness. But I rather suspect that we'll find that it's one continuum of, let's say, more solidified and less solidified, and that in the domain where science could explore next, just below the quantum level, approaching the level where, let's say, whatever it is actually is the stuff of consciousness. I'm a little wary of using the word stuff, but it's either way. It's either it's not stuff at all, or it's all stuff. So it's either stuff all the way back, or non-stuff all the way forward.
Or you use analogies like frequency and vibration.
Yes. So some other, we're bound by the terminology that we have. Well, I think Tesla, you see, is a very interesting case because he claimed that he'd been able to get. He supposed that there was an ether. I think he arrived at that view, in spite of the fact that the Michelson-Morley experiment had disproved it. And what my understanding of his work is that he showed that if he generated very high static voltages, and particularly caused them to change very quickly, he could actually create compression waves and so on in the ether that he supposed was there, and produce effects from those ether consequences of the electrical effects. And that's very intriguing. Nobody has really been able to replicate that since, but there are a few people sort of on the fringe who, suggesting that they're heading in that direction. But that again points to the possibility that there may in fact be this etheric level, and it's interesting, of course, that's a term out of the esoteric tradition as well, and that there may be some middle ground between the purely physical and the purely mental, which science can enter and begin to investigate, and that there you would find, the morphic field, you would find the thought form becoming materialized, and and all of that.
A fifth field or further field.
Yes.
So I think there's something more we need to postulate.
Yeah, but that, of course, is exactly where all this would become quite powerful, and you really want, a great deal of the spiritual, let's say the spiritual understanding of what you're moving, the domain you're moving into. If science is going to probe that far, that deep, then you need some, well, let's say again, metaphysical or mystical insight into where you're headed, rather than just like somebody taking the back off a watch and prodding it with a screwdriver. You need to know where you're going, and have a sense that there is some responsibility coming from that connectedness to that whole, and a respect for that. So I think that's how the ethic might develop, and I think in the future, if all goes well, we move into a more spiritually oriented society whereas religion in the past laid down various dogmatic assertions about the way things were, I think science will be beginning to show us, in combination with mystical experience, that in fact there is, let's say, an empirical structure to the inner world, which can in fact be uncovered, and that it becomes, in a sense, part of science, it becomes part of society's cultural knowledge.
Well, that's a very encouraging prospect. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.